If we want to understand why Brigham Young ordered the evacuation of northern Utah to Provo, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we must understand that Brigham Young was fearful of an army that was coming to Utah. And these fears of armies had developed over a long period of time. Brigham Young was in Missouri during the Mormon-Missouri War. He didn't participate in the war himself, but he was left with the responsibility of getting the saints out of Missouri, because Joseph Smith and some of the other church leaders were imprisoned in Missouri. It was something that was extremely difficult for him. Well, for some reason, my clicker's not working. I've got it turned on.
Okay. Maybe you can just use your down arrow.
Yeah.
There you go.
Okay, that'll work. He was fearful of armies coming. His wife, Mary Ann Angel, as they were leaving Missouri, was left with the responsibility of caring for her whole family. And she wrote that their footprints were not infrequently marked with blood on the ice and snow because they were leaving the state during the winter. Well, Brigham Young was appointed as governor of Utah Territory in 1850. And then in 1857, President Buchanan decided to remove Brigham Young and to appoint Alfred Cumming as the new governor, and to appoint a whole set of officials who were not Latter-day Saints. Brigham Young was extremely fearful of what was happening. And so what he did was to order Lieutenant General Daniel H. Wells, who was commander of the Nauvoo Legion, to send troops to the high desert where the army was coming in, and to burn their supply trains. They burned 3 sets of supply trains, and the Army also established fortifications in Echo Canyon to try to prevent the Army from entering into Salt Lake City. The Army consisted of about 2,500 soldiers. They were supposed to come here to escort Governor Cumming and the new officials. But the people in Utah learned something about this army. One of the officers, Randolph Marcy, said that the Mormons needed to be annihilated. So they were planning to kill Mormons here in Utah. Major Fitzhugh Porter, who was Johnston's adjutant, said that they should exterminate the Mormons. They deserve no mercy at the hands of the federal government, he said. Brigham Young understood that the saints could not hold off the army indefinitely, and that they had to do something to deal with the problem. He decided that what they ought to do was something like the Russians had done during the Crimean War of 1854-55. They were fighting the combined armies of France and England, and instead of trying to hold out against them, which they knew they couldn't, they evacuated Sevastopol in the Crimean Peninsula and moved their soldiers back into the Russian mainland. And then the French simply occupied Sevastopol instead of following them. Referring to the Russian example, Brigham Young said, they may have their Sevastopol after it is vacated, but they cannot have it before. You may ask whether I am willing to burn my house. Yes, and to be the first man that will put the torch to my dwellings, Brigham Young said. If we are obliged to remove cache and lay waste, it is for our good. It is not for our injury. Our enemies are determined to blot us out of existence if they can, but we shall have to leave our buildings. They will possess them, and I am in favor of leaving them before I am obliged to do so. We want 500 families to go south forthwith and be ready to raise corn, potatoes, beans, and so forth this season. I would rather see this city in ashes than have one good elder killed. Mary Ann Young, Brigham Young's first wife, said, I am in favor, or I should say his second wife, but his legal wife at the time, I am in favor of leaving here without fighting. I would be sorry to see that one good brother had lost his life defending my home. Now, Brigham Young had considered several other possibilities. He sent a group of people to the White Mountains, now in Nevada, to see if they could settle there. He negotiated with some developers on the Mosquito Coast of Nicaragua, and there was already a settlement in Fort Limhi in what was then Oregon Territory, but is now in Idaho. That settlement was attacked by a group of Bannock and Shoshone Indians, and they had to evacuate it. So the only other possibilities were possibly the White Mountains, but that area was not large enough to hold the Mormon settlers, and it would be extremely difficult to move to the Mosquito Coast in Nicaragua. Well, what began to happen then, on March 25th of 1858, the Saints began to dismantle buildings, to pack up everything that they could in Salt Lake City. They went to where they'd started constructing the foundation of the Salt Lake Temple. They covered the foundation with dirt and made it appear like it was a field ready to plant. They stored some of the windows from the old tabernacle and transported others and the tabernacle organ to Provo. Richard Bentley began loading books and papers from the church historian's office to transport to Utah County. Freighters took loads of books and documents from the historian's office and began moving south. James Ivey was severely injured when his mule team panicked and tipped over his wagon, and the boxes spilled out on the street, breaking one of them open. The freighters relied to some extent on Bishop Elias H. Blackburn of Provo. He assisted the Saints from the north in finding places for food and lodging, and he transported goods from Salt Lake City himself. Wilford Woodruff and others took numerous loads of goods. He had the help of Robert Campbell and Richard Bentley. They loaded a wagon with 3 tons of flour, which they took to Provo in April. As late as June 11th, orders came from Salt Lake City to Bishop Blackburn to send all the teams possible to Salt Lake City to help in transporting these goods. The other general authorities were involved, finding places to get food and other supplies in Spanish Fork and Springville and other towns in Utah County. John Taylor actually set up a carding machine to supply wool for clothing. The trip was extremely difficult. On April 1st, as they traveled west and south, they found a windstorm that they had to deal with, and they encountered snowstorms as they were moving south as well. Wilford Woodruff took his family to Provo. He took all of his wives there. Brigham Young and others evacuated their wives to Provo. On one of the trips that Wilford Woodruff took, he simply could not make it to Provo, so he stopped at Martisha Smith's place. She was Abraham O. Smoot's sister, spent the evening of April 10th with her, and then continued on. This was an extremely difficult situation for the saints as they move from Salt Lake City and towns to the north to Utah County. Brigham Young settled most of his families at the current site of the Utah County Courthouse in a place they call Bowery Row or Bowery Park there. The families settled in various different places in Utah County. Some settled 4 miles north of the city in a place that the church had set aside as a pasture. Bishop Frederick Kessler of the Salt Lake 16th Ward camped with members of his family west of Provo near that pasture that I mentioned. Now, it wasn't just the saints from Salt Lake City who came south. Those from northern Utah came south as well. Lorenzo Snow and the saints from Brigham City moved south to Provo. The settlements such as Bountiful, that was then called Sessions Settlement, Willard, then called North Willow Creek, Brigham City, which had been called Box Elder, Wellsville from over in Cache Valley, and all of the settlements in between. Now, how did the saints settle there? Some of them took the tops, the wagon boxes, off Conestoga wagons and settled in those. They took them off the wheels and axles and settled. Others lived in tents and dugouts. Some of the dugouts may have looked like this. This was extremely difficult for the women. They had to cook, sew, carry on other normal household activities out in the open. And with the weather the way it was during the spring, it was extremely difficult for them. The roads were bad between Salt Lake City and between the northern Utah settlements as they came down south toward Utah County and settled in Utah County, and they were spread out. Imagine the number of people there who were living there together. Well, there came to be some help. On February 25th of 1858, Thomas L. Kane, who'd been a friend of the Mormons for a long time, arrived in Salt Lake City. He had 3 letters of introduction from President Buchanan, but Buchanan made it clear that Kane was going on his own hook, and he paid for his own travel. He traveled to the Isthmus of Panama, crossed the isthmus and caught a boat north to San Diego, and then came overland to Salt Lake City. He decided that if there was anyone who could help the Saints to get out of this difficulty, he could do it. On March 8th of 1858, he went to Fort Bridger, where the troops had settled. He met with Governor Cumming. General Johnston told Governor Cumming not to go to Salt Lake City with Thomas Kane, but Kane convinced him that he ought to do that, and that if he went, he would be greeted as the governor of Utah Territory by the Latter-day Saints. Well, Kane and Cumming went to Salt Lake. They were protected by the Nauvoo Legion, the Utah Territorial Militia, as they traveled. And after they got there, Kane went to Brigham Young and he said, "Look, I've caught the fish and now you cook it as you have a mind to." Young and George A. Smith met with Cumming in the Staines Mansion, which is now the Devereaux House on North Temple. While in Salt Lake City, Cumming investigated the charges that had been made by these people who said the Mormons were rebels, and he found that, contrary to what had been said, they did not destroy the records of the district court. They had not killed one of the judges, and the other charges or specific charges that were made were simply not true. Cumming met with the Saints in the old tabernacle and gave a talk to them. He said that the army was coming to protect them from the, quote, savages, and he offered security to those who wanted to leave the territory. In spite of some of the charges by anti-Mormons that Brigham Young refused to allow dissidents to leave, Brigham Young told them that if they wanted to leave, they were certainly willing to do so. They certainly could do so. Well, in the meantime, John Bernheisel, who was the territorial delegate from Utah, had been working in the East with President Buchanan. And he convinced Buchanan to send a peace commission to Utah with a document that gave amnesty to the Latter-day Saints. And this commission was led by 2 people, Major Benjamin McCullough of Texas. McCullough was a former Texas Ranger, and he was currently U.S. Marshal for Texas. And with him was Lazarus Powell, who was a former governor of Kentucky and currently was the senator-elect from Kentucky. And what they gave to the saints, essentially, was an ultimatum, a take it or leave it proclamation. You either sign this proclamation, we're not negotiating with you. This proclamation has been written and approved by the president. It will give you amnesty from anything you may have done, but we won't negotiate about the thing. Elder, later first counselor to the first presidency, George A. Smith, read the proclamation, and he said, this proclamation contains 42 false charges against us. Now, what would the saints do with a proclamation that contained a lot of falsehood about them? Well, Brigham Young decided it didn't matter. He was going to sign it. He said, if a man comes from the moon and says he will pardon me for kicking him on the moon yesterday, I don't care about it. I'll accept of his pardon. It don't affect me in one way or another. Well, the Army came through Salt Lake City, and they established Camp Floyd in Cedar Valley, west of the Lake Mountains and near the Oquirrh Mountains. And on July 2nd, the streets were crowded with wagons, herds of cattle, flocks of sheep, and people returning to their homes in northern Utah. Some 25 members of Brigham Young's family arrived in Salt Lake City on July the 2nd. So they had been in Utah County from April into July. And some of them decided to stay in Utah County. Since I live in Utah County, I can't blame them for wanting to. Hey, let me just kind of stand back from this a little bit and ask, what do we make of the move south? Given Brigham Young's fear of armies and these threats that were made, that they were going to exterminate the Mormons, his decision to evacuate these communities and to try to settle away from them, like the Russians had done in Sevastopol, seems reasonable. There were, nevertheless, a number of negative features to it. With the difficulty they had in moving, it was extremely expensive. It probably cost millions of dollars for them to do that. I don't know how you would calculate exactly how much it cost. It was difficult to move. They were moving in snowstorms and in windstorms. Had they remained in their homes in northern Utah, instead of packing up their families and living in tents and dugouts and wagon boxes, they could have gone to bed in their own homes. They could have plowed their own fields and planted wheat and vegetables, pruned their fruit trees and bushes, and cared for their animals. We must also consider the disruption of normal life of these people, especially for the Mormon women. It was extremely difficult for them. They had to cook on stoves in the outdoors, churn butter, make cheese, spin thread, because most of the things were homemade clothing at the time, in dirt yards, and it clearly subjected the women particularly to incalculable physical and psychological stress. The move south then was expensive, backbreaking, and stressful, but given the clear understanding that the soldiers planned to kill the Latter-day Saints, it seems to me that it was understandable. Thank you. Now, I'll be glad to answer some questions if any of you have any. Yes. They were there from April through July, the early part of July in 1858. But they came in at various times, and then they began leaving in mid-June after the amnesty proclamation had been signed. But for some of them, it took them into July. Yes.
I'm just trying to picture, here you have some saints that come across the plain, they're getting away from all this garbage, all these mobs, all of this, oh, they're going west to avoid this, and then they run into this. What in the records would indicate that they were still excited to be here versus
because the percentage of those who decided to leave the church during this period was relatively small. And they had faith in the church leaders, in Brigham Young, the Quorum of the 12, Brigham Young's counselors, and their local leaders. The local leaders didn't just send them to Utah County. They went with them and lived with them. They experienced the same difficulties that they did. And the members of the Quorum of the 12 did the same thing. Lorenzo Snow, who was an apostle but a leader in Brigham City, went south with them. Wilford Woodruff and Brigham Young all went there. They came back to Salt Lake City when Alfred Cumming came, and he talked to those who were still there. But you know, their leaders didn't just send them. They participated in these difficulties with them. Yes.
Didn't actually come into the valley until after this evacuation was over?
Yes, that's right. Well, in March, he came in. The evacuation was going on at the time that he came in. So the evacuation was still going on when he came in. And in fact, he tried to encourage the saints not to evacuate. They were already moving, and they continued to move while he was there.
So is this before the army comes in?
Yes, it was before the army.
Comes in ahead.
They came in after the saints had already evacuated. Yes. Yeah.
Wasn't the original plan to be of Johnson's army to be in Salt Lake in the fall of 57?
Yes, they planned to be in, but this destroying their wagon trains, it ruined their supplies. So they didn't have the supplies they needed. And they actually had to send to New Mexico to get more horses because those had been scattered by Lotsmith and others who were carrying on these activities to try to slow them down. In addition to this, Johnston had not arrived yet. Edmund Alexander, I hope he's no relation, was in charge of the army at that time, and he was really a dope. And he decided that he was going to, instead of trying to go down Echo Canyon, because they knew that had been fortified, he decided he was going to take them up by the Bear River route Soda Springs, and then come in from the north. Well, by that time, it was winter. They couldn't make it, and so they decided to go back to Fort Bridger. And Fort Bridger had been burned by the Mormons by that time. So they had to establish a separate camp there. They called Camp Scott. It was named after Winfield Scott, who was the commanding general of the armies. Well, that's probably telling you more than you wanted to know, Barnard. Yeah.
How much did the Eastern media have any influence on all these things, like Harper's Weekly?
The Eastern media had a great influence in disseminating the information that these officials who were in Utah wrote back to the East. They published letters that the judges and the Surveyor General and others had written in Utah, making these charges against the Mormons. Judge William W. Drummond charged the Mormons had killed Judge Schaefer, and that they had killed Alvin Babbitt. In fact, Schaefer died a natural death, and one of the doctors that did the autopsy on him was a Gentile. Babbitt had died on the plains. He was killed by Cheyenne Indians, and there was an investigation by the commander of Fort Kearney that showed that that had been the case, that the Mormons didn't have anything to do then.
That was too late.
Yeah, that's right. It wasn't until after Cumming got to, well, those investigations had been done before, but they didn't believe the Mormons when they said that we didn't kill Schaefer, or we didn't kill Babbitt, or we didn't destroy those court records. Yes.
Whatever became of Alfred Cumming.
Alfred Cumming continued to stay in Utah until after the war, the Civil War began. In 1862, he left and went back to Georgia and joined the Confederacy. He was from the South, and so we went back there. Yes.
I've always wondered if the troops had disobeyed the treaty and began to look for Mormons to kill, why wouldn't they have been able to go to Provo and attack them there?
Actually, some of the troops did go to Provo, and they established a place where they actually interned the mayor of Provo, and Alfred Cumming wrote to the Attorney General of the United States and told them what the soldiers were doing. And the Attorney General told General Johnston that he had to listen to the governor, that he couldn't send troops out for anything unless the governor approved that. And so those troops were withdrawn from Provo. Yes.
How long would it take this Kane with documents in his to get to Panama to
get here?
Get here, yeah.
He left in December, and he didn't get here until February 28th to Salt Lake City.
That's quite a deal.
Yeah, it is. He had to cross the isthmus and take a ship north. And of course, in 1858, I don't know whether he had a steamship or not, but by 1858, probably.
We should have more of his monuments around, I think. We've got Kane County, and there's
Just one on the Capitol grounds.
there's Kane up that way. We should talk more about him, shouldn't we?
Yeah. Well, there's been a really good biography of him by Matt Groh that you may want to read. It's an excellent biography of Thomas L. Kane. Matt Groh is on the staff of the Church History Library, but He did an excellent job on that biography. Yes.
He was
Mary?
also very ill at the time, wasn't he?
He
His
was.
health was very fragile and he risked his life to do this.
He was very ill throughout his life. We have a large collection of the Kane papers at BYU, and then there are some others at Stanford University, but yes, he was ill during that time. Yeah, Brad?
Tom, I understand the injustice. I truly do. But could you speak to some of the kind of anti-Republican or the sort of theocratic nature of what was being done in Utah? And of course, we have people in Washington. There's lots of opportunities to explain ourselves. What part does Mormon society play in this picture?
Okay, it was a separate society. They tried to separate themselves from the others, and it was a theodemocratic or theocratic. Both terms have been used to refer to it because when the church put forward candidates for positions, they expected the church members to vote for them, and virtually all of them did. And that was one of the charges that was true. These other specific charges that I mentioned were not, but they were a theocratic society, yes. Okay. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much.